Hello there. I write and I tell stories, and sometimes those two worlds meet. I will write the stories I've told, or I will tell the stories I've written. Right now, I'm reading a book by Amy King. She's one of my favorite YA authors. This is called Reality Boy. And a lot of the action takes place at the protagonist's part time job at a concession stand at a place similar to the BJCC. So, as you can well imagine, food is a big part of the background, not the main action. But since he works at a concession stand, the protagonist, there's food in the background as he's preparing it, selling it, getting mad at it, throwing it at people. And I realized that food takes place or is a big part of a lot of what I read and what I write and the stories I tell. Food is sometimes the impetus and the inspiration of the stories I tell, especially the nonfiction, the creative nonfiction stories I tell. And I think it can be a part of the stories you write and the stories you tell. I cook as well as eat. I'm an amateur chef, or as my friend says, I'm not a chef, chefs get paid. I'm a poorly dressed homosexual who likes to cook. At any rate, the other day, I decided to recreate the very first recipe I ever made when I was 13 years old, which is neither here nor there, but it got me thinking how I came to make it. And I won't tell you that whole story because that's not what I'm here to do, but there's a story behind the story and it relates to food. I was having supper at a friend's house. She had invited me over to eat. And when I took the first bite, I never cursed as a child. I was a model child. But when I took the first bite, I said, "What the hell is this?" And her father was a little offended. And he said, "Well, I'm sorry if the turkey isn't to your liking." And I said, "This isn't turkey. I've had turkey." And I had turkey. My mother cooked turkey for Thanksgiving and Christmas. But as I said to him, turkey is dry and salty and needs copious amounts of gravy to make it palatable. And this was juicy and delicious. This can't be turkey. And before the night was done, I had raided their refrigerator. This was the first time I'd been to their house. First time I'd met her parents. I raided their refrigerator, amazed. This can't be roast beef. It's not gray. This is pink. This isn't roast beef. That was when I learned that my mother didn't know how to cook. I'd been eating her food for 13 years, thinking this is what food tasted like. And it didn't. My mother was a lousy cook, and I never knew it until I had real food. So at age 13, I decided I had to learn how to cook because I liked real food. And from that came a story, how I learned to cook. And I became the household cook at age 13 in middle school because when the rest of my family sampled real food, they decided they liked it better than the stuff my mom had been preparing. That became a story, not just a creative nonfiction story, but I used elements of that in some of the fiction that I was writing. A mom who didn't know how to cook, and sometimes the family knew it, and sometimes the family didn't. I used elements of that real life scenario in more than one piece of fiction. We eat every day. We cook, some of us, every day, or we eat out every day. And there's a history of that in our lives. Most of us have had a first date that involved a meal. That's a story. That first date, was it great? Was it awful? Were you the one who asked the other person out, or did the other person ask you out? Where did you go? What did you do? That can either be a creative nonfiction story, or you can use elements of that in your fiction. Even if you never write a word of it down, during character development, you can use pieces of that first date as a history of one of your characters. If not the protagonist, a background character, a subsidiary character. How did you learn to cook? When you were a child, a small person, and I wish we had a gender neutral pronoun because I keep wanting to say a little boy or a little girl, and you may not be either one of those. You may not be cisgender, you may be a they, a he, a she, I don't know. But when you were a small person, did you stand at the kitchen counter and watch a grandparent preparing cookies, cakes, dinner, or your mother or father preparing a meal or a favorite dish? Did you just sit there and watch? Or did you chat? What did you chat about? Did you try to recreate later as an adult what they prepared? My friend Carmen Didi, who is a storyteller, tells a wonderful story about trying to recreate her aunt's arroz con leche, rice pudding. She loved her aunt's rice pudding. No one could make it as well as her aunt. And she tried and she tried, and her aunt never gave her the recipe. She never wrote down the recipe. And Carmen tried and tried and tried to recreate it, and she came close, but she could never get it just right. And it just disappointed her because she wanted her aunt's rice pudding, not her mom's, not some stores, not another relative's, not her own. She wanted her aunt's, and she could never get it like her aunt's. And finally, when Carmen was grown and her aunt was in her dotage and frail and living in assisted living, finally, Carmen was visiting her and she said, please give me the recipe. And so her aunt said, after many years, okay, fine, here's what you do. You take some of this and a handful of that. And Carmen said, what, some, a handful? I need measurements. There are no measurements. I just take some of this and a handful of that. And Carmen is writing this down. And her aunt passed away, and Carmen tried to recreate it, and it didn't taste anything like it. In disgust, she threw it into the kitchen sink, and her own daughter said, Mama, what are you doing? No one makes rice pudding like you do. I've been trying for years to recreate yours. So do you have an aunt or a grandmother or a dad who made something that you've been trying to recreate? Did you recreate it? Did you fail? Is there some recipe or some relative who refuses, absolutely refuses, to share the treasured and hallowed family recipe for great grandma's buttercream cake? Don't you hate relatives like that? Are you a relative like that? Do you refuse to share the recipe? And if so, why? Do you have a valid reason? There's a story there. Share it. If not in creative nonfiction, which would make a hell of a good story, by the way. If not there, then in fiction. Is there a character? Because that's a good character. Is there Mrs. So-and-so down the street who makes the best lane cake like Miss Marty in To Kill a Mockingbird, but refuses to share it? Or who does share it and then really aggravates the other relative who passed it on to her? Share that. Everyone gathers for meals at the holidays. And that's when the stories that you've told each other 100 times, you tell 101st, the 101st time. You know the stories, they're the family stories that you've rehearsed year after year after year, and you never get tired of hearing them, and you never get tired of sharing them. Everybody knows them, and you still enjoy hearing them. You still laugh, even though you know what's coming next. The best stories are the one that starts out, do you remember the time that Uncle Harry got to dinner drunk? Do you remember the time that Louise brought that bum home as her boyfriend? Do you remember the time that Mom forgot to take the bag of giblets out of the turkey's butt? Do you remember the time that, if you have a story where the first words are, do you remember the time that? Do you remember when? Do you remember? If you have a story that starts, do you remember, this, that you tell around the family meal, put that in a story. It might be the story, but even if it's not, if it is, boom, you got some good creative nonfiction there. Start with that. That's your springboard. But even if you don't want to do it as creative nonfiction, you've got some good character development. You can put elements of it in the fiction or use it for your character development in the background. Hi, Kat. When you're, I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. When you're creating your characters and you're putting their history together, that can be part of their history that will inform them and inform you when you're creating them and making a three-dimensional person instead of a two-dimensional person. Food shows up at funerals and it shows up at sick beds. Who brought what? Does the same person bring the same casserole every single time? Is there a new food you discovered at Granny's funeral? What is this? This is disgusting. Who would dare bring this when I'm grieving? This is to comfort me. What is this? This is fantastic. This is the best thing I've ever had in my entire life. I feel guilty for enjoying this when I should be mourning. These are things that establish and describe who and what someone is, both the person who brought the dish and the person who is enjoying or not enjoying the dish. Food does a lot for a story. Food can be the story. When you're preparing the meal, are you enjoying it? I can't stand that son of a bitch. I wish he would choke to death on this. Oh, he hates raisins? Let's put some extra raisins in here. I love him so much. I adore raisins. I can't imagine eating this without them, but he doesn't like them. I'll leave them out. These are things, food can do a lot for a story. It also gives a character something to do. When you've got a long bit of dialogue and it's just quote, he says, quote, she says, he says, she says, you got to break that up. And you can break that up by having them take a sip of coffee, or chopping an onion, or stabbing a piece of cake with a fork. And how you eat, stabbing a piece of cake, grabbing a piece of cake, how you eat, what you do, what kind of food. Does someone eat nothing but sour onions, or do they eat sweet peaches? Food and writing, they can inform each other. So chew on that the next time you're writing, and the next time you get stuck for an idea, just sit back and think, well, what was the first kitchen I ever had? My first apartment. Think about that first kitchen, the first meal you prepared. There's a story there. Think about that first date. Where did you go? Think about your first Thanksgiving meal that you cooked. Think about the worst meal you ever had, the best meal you ever had. There's stories in food. All you have to do is find them. Thanks.